young age, and this lecture is in his memory. So thank you for joining us tonight for that. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Tom Palmer, comes to us from, well, pretty much everywhere around the world. He has lived in a number of different countries, including many during times of civil strife or civil war. So his experience comes through when he's gives voice to his books, which he has also generously provided a number of these books. They are out front near the sign-in sheets. So please take advantage of that option. Dr. Palmer is the Executive Vice President of the International Programs for the Atlas Network, which is an organization that helps provide economic advice, liberty, and support to a number of non-governmental organizations around the world, and does very important work in developing countries, and especially in those countries that do have some issues, such as civil unrest of some sort or another. He will be talking today on the topic of peace, love, and liberty, or war, hatred, and oppression. Which will it be? And again, because he has spent so much time in so many different countries under some very difficult conditions, he has a lot of background to bring to us. Now, one thing that he did mention that perhaps you don't know, I don't think it's in any of your resumes that are available online, but he is a smuggler. And I don't think he's reformed. So you might want to ask him about that, and perhaps he'll give some details. Please welcome Tom Palmer.
Thank you very much. I think I'm okay on that. Well, it's a pleasure, and I hope that I can do honor to Professor Saurman's memory. I did pick a provocative title. It's a provocative lecture series. The title of this little book, Peace, Love, and Liberty, is pretty provocative to begin with, but then what's the opposite to it? Well, war, hatred, and oppression. It's a collection of essays by different scholars and academics and folks around the world, and some poetry, because I think poetry and artistic appreciation is part of understanding the world as well. It's a part of a series of books that I brought out in the last couple of years, one a year, Frederick Bastiat on the Economics of Freedom, a little book on the morality of capitalism, which has come out in 35 or so different languages. You can get the Amharic or Urdu editions if you want. After that, a topic of great interest to young people after the welfare state, what happens when the bills come due and we find that the state cannot fulfill the promises that is made to people. And then Why Liberty, which is mainly written by young people, not all of them native speakers of English, so I help them to express their ideas on liberty. And then this most recent book that just came out September 1st. Now, the most important thing to think about war is it doesn't just happen. People often say a war happened. It's a bit like when you read these accounts of police-related shootings. It says, and then the gun fired. So, well, the gun didn't just fire. The policeman shot somebody. That's really what happened. And wars don't just happen. If we can understand what causes war, we can not only work for peace, but we can change the incentives. The economics faculty, they talk about incentives all the time. Incentives are very, very important in understanding and helping to shape human behavior. What are the incentives for war or for peace? We can create the institutions that make war less likely. Now, some people say, well, we just want to abolish war. I do too. But reducing it is a good thing. If war can be reduced in its the destruction and its incidents, that's a good thing and something that we should work for. We can substitute peace for war, love for hatred, and liberty for oppression. It's not just idealism. It's very realistic. This is about thinking realistically in hard-headed ways about what will make the world more peaceful. Now, I mentioned that wars don't just happen. They're not like tornadoes or lightning. We just say, well, thunder happened, the lightning struck, there was a tornado. Wars are not like that. They are the results of choices and of ideas held by people that impel them to those choices. It is organized human violence. This is something I catch myself doing. Whenever I say people died in the war, I remind myself they didn't just die. Somebody killed them. And that's what we should always keep in our minds. Somebody killed them. So there were now, it said in the news just a few hours ago, 7 Ukrainian soldiers died in Donetsk. You read down and it says it's because a tank shell hit them. They didn't just die. Somebody killed them. And that's what we should always keep in mind. War is the organization of violence. The purpose of it is to kill people, to destroy their stuff. I mentioned a conversation I had many years ago with retired Rear Admiral Jean Larocque, who was a flagship officer in the United States Navy. Very interesting person. And his conversation, this goes back many decades, it really stuck in my mind. He said, the purpose of the military is to kill people and destroy their ability to harm us. We're not very good at teaching 8-year-olds how to read and write. We're not very good at teaching people civics lessons. We are not very good at building bridges unless the point is to put a tank on the other side. We kill people and we destroy stuff. And if you need that, if that is necessary to defend your lives, call us. Otherwise, don't. All those people who say we should use the military for this purpose and that purpose do not understand it. In the book, I relate something that struck me when it happened, so I went and did the research to get all the documentation, so I had it right. Madeleine Albright, once Secretary of State and former representative of the United Nations, where she distinguished herself in a debate on the Iraqi intervention by saying, after all, we're not the ones with all these weapons of mass destruction. I hope you see the irony in that. The United States has more weapons of mass destruction than all the other states in the world combined. And it seems she did not know that. She just was unaware of this fact. She said to General Colin Powell, who at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, she said, what's the point of this powerful military you keep talking about if you don't use it? And General Powell wrote in his autobiography, he said, I almost had a heart attack. I almost had a heart attack. What's the point of this military if you don't use it? The point is not to have to use it. So you can be strong enough, people will not attack you. But the idea that somehow them sitting in their bases are not doing anything, and you should do something with them, is a terrible, gross misunderstanding of what the military is. And as he pointed out, they're not toy soldiers you can move around on a child's playground. They're not chess pieces or checkers pieces. These are human beings. And you will kill them if you do these things. And their job, when you put them there, is to kill other people. So that's the first point. Second is there's another victim of war that most people don't talk about, and that is freedom. It is during times of war that a crisis mentality is created, and people are told we must all band together. We can't have disunity. We can't have disagreement. That's the time when you begin to lose your liberty. And we have seen it even in this country. Think about this. Welcome to the NSA. Well, actually, the NSA already welcomed themselves to your data. And they did so illegally. They did so against the Constitution. They did so against legislation passed by Congress and in direct violation of orders from the judiciary. The executive branch broke the law over and over and over. And Mr. Snowden informed us of this. Whatever you think of all the circumstances about that, I have to say, I'm grateful to him for having alerted us to the illegal behavior of our government. That what they did was illegal, flatly prohibited. And then to have senior officials of the administration caught lying to Congress under oath about these programs. They lied to us. They lied to the members of the Congress. These are questions that were presented to them in advance. It wasn't that they just said, oh, it slipped my mind. They had advanced time to prepare for this, and they lied to us. And they did so under oath. And I can just mention, if anyone in this room did that, you would be indicted, and you would be in very serious trouble. Why was the head of the NSA not indicted? For lying to the Congress. The reason, we know. It's a war situation. We're in a war against terror. And you can justify anything in a war against terror. In some ways, it's more dangerous than a war against a discrete enemy. What is terror? It's a tactic. How can you wage war on a tactic? How do you know when you won? When you occupy the capital of terror? When you get the terror flag? How do you know you won? It's a recipe for unending war. And that means unending assaults on our Constitution, unending assaults on the rule of law. We have, of course, the USA Patriot Act, uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorists. If you followed me, that spells USA Patriot. Some high-powered government employee earning $240,000 a year was up all night working on that. Why? Because if you voted against it, you voted against patriotism. You're not a patriot if you voted against the Patriot Act. But the members of Congress did not read this document. Most people here are too young to remember this, but there was an anthrax scare. Some crazy person was putting anthrax in envelopes, and the members of Congress didn't want to open their mail. Maybe a little understandable. But the consequence of that was they did not read the bill on which they voted. It was really shocking. And in it were a whole range of assaults on the rule of law, additional powers to prosecutors, not needed for combating terrorists. And that's very important to keep in mind. Years ago, I debated an advocate of this. He's a well-known journalist, William Crystal, editor of the Weekly Standard. I'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. And he said, well, I'm not an expert on the Patriot Act, unlike Tom. And my response was a little mean. I said, I just read it. I didn't go to the USA Patriot Act school or something and get a degree. I just read the bill. It's very long, but you can do it. His response, when I went through objectionable elements of it, some of it is not objectionable. Increasing funding for this and that, and new computer systems and so on. Some of it's questionable, and some of it is downright unconstitutional. His response was to say, well, Tom, I don't see why you're worried about this. These are things prosecutors have been asking for years. And I said, that's one of the reasons I'm worried about it. It's not about combating terrorists. It's not about making us safer. It's things prosecutors want because due process of law is a hassle. That's why they want it. And I don't think it's right to give them all of these additional powers and dress it up as a move against terrorism, which is what happened. But now there's another one that all the young men in the room, and some of the older, will remember. The Selective Service System. Turn 19 and register yourself as property of the state. You don't really belong to yourself. The state has a claim on your life. Now, it's interesting, the name, by the way, brings up this idea of freedom. Not only is it a service system, should be servitude, but it was selective. When this was initially established during World War I, it was during a period of high socialist thinking called progressivism at the time, and the idea was the state would select who would serve and who wouldn't. There were too many volunteers in that insane, unjustified, crazy war. And so consequently, they had to make sure that the valuable ones didn't go to war, and all the rest of you would. that they got to decide who was going to be favored and who was expendable. Same time that they're getting also IQ tests to weed out the dummies and send them to the front lines. The others, of course, are going to be kept in the elite. I was very active in the late 1970s and 1980s trying to get rid of this. We almost did. Almost. Unfortunately, President Reagan, who was with us at the time, he did not like the draft. He thought it was unjustified and unconstitutional. But his advisors came to him and said, the Soviets had just invaded in 1979 Afghanistan. You have to keep this as a signal to the Soviets. I don't think the Soviets were paying any attention. Sadly, he listened to that stupid advice, and we didn't get rid of it. I would still love to drive a stake through the heart of the selective service system. Third point, if you favor limited government, you should be against moves to war. Randolph Bourne, writing in the middle of the First World War, put it so neatly: war is the health of the state. The state grows during war faster than at any other time. It is like the magic grow fertilizer for big government. Big government will grow and grow and grow during times of war. Thomas Paine put it very neatly when talking about taxes, quite a pithy statement. In reviewing the history of the English government, its wars and taxes, an observer not blinded by prejudice nor warped by interest would declare that taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but that wars were raised to carry on taxes. And if you look at the evidence of taxation, you'll find that's the case. Taxes spike up during wartime, as does government expenditure. After the war, it may fall, but never to the level it was before. There's what is called a ratchet effect, as you are ratcheted up and up and up. In many countries, they still pay taxes dating back to the First World War. In Germany, I remember the taxes you paid to finance the German imperial fleet. Germany has not had an imperial fleet for a very, very long time. The taxes persisted, nonetheless. Once you get a tax, it's very hard to undo it. Now, some people argue war is good for the economy. And I don't think that's correct. War is destructive. You cannot become wealthy by blowing up your stuff. But here is the perspective of our, let's call them vulgar Keynesian economists. Iraq war is good for the economy. You got to make all those Humvees. People were busy. Then you sent them over to Iraq, and other people blew them up. How great is that? You got to make more and send those over. And so someone blew those up. Think of how busy you were. Humvee production was really going through the roof. But is that economic growth? Is that adding to the wealth of the nation when you blow all your stuff up? The answer is no. This is pure destructionism. And every time you hear people say, well, war, military industry, this is good for the economy, ask them, is it good for your economy and your household if I come in and blow all your stuff up? Did I make you better off because now you get to replace it and repair it? I don't think so. If you want to do a little amusing research, I encourage you to go to YouTube and in the search box type in the following words: Paul Krugman, alien invasion. And there you'll see Paul Krugman being interviewed by Fareed Zakaria, along with Ken Rogoff from Harvard University. And Krugman says, what our economy needs, the best thing would be an alien invasion, so we could arm ourselves. Think of all the death rays and things we'd have to build to fight off the aliens. And the most delicious point is Ken Rogoff, who's a very serious economist, is on the screen, and he's looking across, and you can see the horror on his face. This utterly crazy comment is made. Now, in the book, I do address this question, you hear repeatedly, that, well, World War II got the United States out of the Great Depression. This is not true. This is an utter myth. Robert Higgs, in a series of articles in the Journal of Economic History that are all footnoted there, so you can go and look them up yourself, points out that is utter rubbish. The economy does not begin to recover until after the war is over. And during the period of the war, although there was massive production of tanks and jeeps and military vehicles, there were no civilian automobiles constructed in the United States. That's not economic growth. Now maybe if the war was justified, you need those tanks. You need to defend yourselves. But do not confuse that with economic growth or with somehow being stimulated into higher levels of prosperity. By every material measure, Americans were worse off during the war. Much older people, I don't think there's anyone old enough in this room to remember wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Mondays and rationing and all of the restrictions on consumption. This was not economic growth. Again, perhaps justifiable as a matter of defense of the country against attack. But that is a cost you bear. It is not a benefit to be attacked by other countries. There's a chapter in the book I really hope you read, especially if you're in the econ faculty. It's by one of my favorite economists, Jean-Baptiste Say. Say was a French liberal economist. When I say liberal, I have a different meaning from the way it's used in the United States. The U.S. is idiosyncratic in its use of political language, and what is called liberal in this country would usually be called social democratic in European countries. Liberal in those countries means more like libertarian in the United States. It means limited government, religious toleration, freedom of speech, market economy, freedom of trade, and so on. And Say articulated a very important insight. It is not bad for me if other people prosper, especially if I trade with them. At the time, there were various crank economists who thought if the country's people do better, then the people in the city will suffer, and vice versa. And Say said that is not true. It's good for the people in the city if the people in the countryside grow more food and prosper, or grow more efficiently. Now, economic nationalists, and I believe economic nationalism is one of the driving forces for war. It's a form of ignorance. Economic nationalists see the interest of nations as being opposed to each other. So let's take one of the prominent ones in the American media. His star is waning, but he used to be much more prominent, a man named Lou Dobbs. He's a prominent television entertainer who talks about the news. And I've had the occasion of debating him on a couple of times and was struck by all the things he didn't know. He confuses budget deficit and trade deficit. They're the same thing, right? Well, no. They have the same word in them, but they're very different things. And so I teased him. I said, by your logic, if I walk past a drinking establishment, I'm a lawyer because I passed the bar. So that cannot be right. You have to focus on what these denote, what they mean. But he used to rail about the Japanese, how angry he was. They were prospering. Not so much anymore. Then now it's the Chinese. Should be angry when the Chinese are prospering. Look at them. They're getting richer. Oh, it makes you so mad. And even, I think this is really crossing the line, he has attacked the Canadians. Really? I mean, talk about the nicest neighbors in the world. 4,000 miles, undefended border, and north of the United States are tens of millions of nice people. So I don't know why you would be angry with them. But they've been doing better, and that must mean we're doing worse. It's a zero-sum mentality. If someone benefits, someone else must have been harmed. And it makes sense to most people, right? There's a balance. But that's not true. It's simply false. There are other kinds of games besides zero-sum games where the sum of the benefits is equal to 0. I get 10, someone else lost 10. There are negative-sum games. That's what most criminality is. Anytime someone is robbed and mugged, the mugger gets $20, and the victim might have to go to hospital for stitches and pay a lot more than $20, plus suffering and pain. The sum of the benefits is negative. Those are all around us. Corruption, bribery, these are normally negative-sum games. Cronyism, and robbery and rape and so on. These are negative sum games. There's also positive sum games that most people don't focus on. Exchange is a positive sum game, as Say explained, without using that language. And here's the simple, not technical explanation of it. Go to a store and buy something, so whatever it is you want to buy, a DVD, and you hand the money, and the merchant says thank you, and you say thank you when you get the DVD. Is this not weird when you think about it for just a moment? Normally, if I thank someone, like for instance, I were just to fall off of this, trip over, this nice gentleman would reach out, give me a hand, I would say thank you, and he would say, you're welcome. That's normal. But when we exchange, I say thank you, and he says thank you. That's weird. It's because we both benefited. Our benefits are both positive. The sum of them is a positive sum. We're involved in positive sum transactions all the time, and most people don't bother to think about them. Well, Say pointed out that the provinces of the countries and countries to town and countries to countries have similar relationships. If you trade with Canadians, you should be happy that they're prosperous. One, they're Canadians. They're nice. Two, it is a sign of bad moral character to wish ill fortune on other people. That's very important. People who want the Chinese to be poor show they have bad moral character. And three, it's stupid. You should be happy when your customers are prosperous. What businessman ever said, woohoo, all my customers are broke. They can't buy my stuff now. Right? I've never heard that. You like it when your customers are prosperous. It's good for you too. There are win-win relations. And Say is very important in understanding international relations, and I talk at some length about that. And in particular, Samuel Huntington, who may be known to some of you, is a very serious political scientist. His great book on the clash of civilizations. It's a zero-sum mentality from start to finish. One civilization rises, another is falling. And one of the examples he gives, he goes through and he calculates the surface area of the planet controlled by European states in 1920 and now. It's much smaller now because of decolonization, because countries became independent. They're no longer colonies of France or Britain or Spain or Portugal. So his view is that's European civilization declining. Well, I did some calculations on it. I said, well, let's look at that. Let's take, and I give two examples, the Netherlands and Indonesia, a former Dutch colony. At one time, Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch. They lost it. It's an independent country. Bad for the Dutch, right? Well, no. Look at per capita income in the Netherlands. Did it fall? It rose dramatically. And look at per capita income in Indonesia. It rose also. If Dutch people want stuff from the Netherlands, they buy it. They don't have to send an army. They don't have to support hordes of bureaucrats and governors and police. You want something from Indonesia? You just buy it from them. It works really well. There was no loss for the Dutch because they lost their colonies. It was better for both. And understanding Say helps us to understand why that is. Another important point, especially for Americans, this book is an international audience, but for Americans, we still hear people say, somehow if you're for peace, you're not patriotic. You're not a real American. Well, this guy was a real American, as far as I know. He was a patriot. I identified the United States with this gentleman. What did he have to say? He wanted to see war banished from the earth. He had fought in wars. He had been the commanding general in the War for Independence. It was terrible. Even that justified war for independence was nothing to be happy about, that they had to kill other people and see their friends killed, was a scourge and a menace. The American founders understood this. They were anti-war. James Madison, primary author of the American Constitution, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. That's very strong language from a very careful and precise writer. Madison was exceptionally careful in his choice of words. The most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. Enhanced police powers, spying, secrecy, additional taxing authorities, violations of the rule of law, on and on. War contains so much folly as well as wickedness that much is to be hoped from the progress of reason. If anything is to be hoped, everything ought to be tried. So there's nothing un-American or unpatriotic about being against war and trying to diminish its incidence. But war was once considered the norm. There were people who thought war was the natural state of humanity. Heraclitus of Ephesus put it, war is the father of all and the king of all. Some he shows as gods, others as men. Some he makes slaves and others free. In the time he's writing, slavery is the inescapable institution of human life. There are slaves and free people. And what he's saying is everything in life is shaped by war. Unsurprisingly, pro-war advocates and people who exult in violence and conflict cite this repeatedly. They get a certain thrill from this. Joseph de Maistre, the famous reactionary writer of the 19th century, anti-liberal writer, liberal in the sense that I use the term, war is the habitual state of mankind, which is to say that human blood must flow without interruption somewhere or other on the globe. This is a very bloody, direct statement of the thesis still found in political science texts that there's a constant quantum of violence. That if it goes down here, it must be raising someplace else. The hydraulic theory, it's been called, of violence. That there's always a constant pressure or amount of violence. And he said, for every nation, peace is only a respite, just a little breather, until war comes again. And he was excited about this. I hope this comes through. This is great. It was fantastic. War was created culture and civilization. And in the book, I cite a number of very prominent figures who argue exactly this. It is war that shapes and creates civilization, and peaceful people cannot have a high culture. This is not true. These figures of the counter-enlightenment believed that there was an inherent antagonism in human life. Steven Pinker from Harvard University is one of the authors in the book, and the author of a really challenging, really interesting, fantastic book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. It's a really important book. It's big, it's difficult, it's challenging, you'll puzzle over it, but it's immensely rewarding. As he pointed out, the counter-enlightenment rejected the idea that violence was a problem to be solved. Everyone understands there is violence in life, but some, the liberals, thought it's a problem, and we need to try to reduce it through moral norms, religion, through institutions, through various practices to try to reduce violence. It is not something to be celebrated. So the first anti-war movement, if you want to put it that way, of the world, I should say, comes about in the modern age. Liberalism. It articulated a philosophy based on peaceful cooperation and saw violence as a problem, something you should try to reduce. And they asked, what reduces violence? What institutions, what practices, what norms can bring that about? One of my great heroes, this man, Frederick Bastiat, he was an economist, an entrepreneur, and a great writer. And he really saved France in 1848 from descending into horrifying dictatorship. There's a certain irony. One of his most famous essays is called What is Seen and What is Not Seen. It's about what economists call opportunity costs. what doesn't happen because a certain choice was made. And the irony is that France could have descended into a horror of dictatorship and did not, substantially because of this man and some of his colleagues who attacked the ideas that were being promoted of communism at the time. Communists took over in Russia and created the Soviet Union and a series of dictatorships and horrors and nightmares that emerged from that. But it could have happened much earlier, and it didn't, partly because of this man. He distinguished liberalism from various forms of collectivism on exactly this issue. He said the distinguishing feature is the role of conflict. It's a problem for liberals, and it's something exciting, something to be exulted in for collectivists. As he said, we see for them there are fundamental antagonisms everywhere. And he listed some. He had a long list between native-born and foreigner, producer and consumer, capital and labor, property owner and worker, that all of life was structured by antagonism, by conflict. And we hear this in a lot of far left and far right discourse today, that somehow we should be opposed to those people. They might be immigrants, they're foreigners, members of other religion, and so on. Now, you might think no one could really be in favor of war, right? I mean, it's just so obvious. If I asked a show of hands, how many of you here think war is great? I'll bet none would come up. Maybe some slightly perverse person who wants to get a chuckle from the audience, but really nobody. But you'd be wrong. There are people, very important and prominent people, who have defended and promoted the virtues of war. I want to introduce you to some, but first, one of the most important political thinkers of the last century. His name was Carl Schmitt. He wrote a great deal of material. This book is very influential in the concept of the political. I'll talk a bit about him. He's a very handsome, dapper gentleman. This is a picture with his good friend Ernst Junger in one of his dapper uniforms. You might figure out what he was doing at the time. He was with the German military intelligence in Paris. Junger was also a very interesting advocate of war, a great novelist who wrote in Stahlgewittern, The Storm of Steel. What they articulated, they were called the conservative revolutionaries at the time, was a philosophy of war. Junger, here he was as an old man, these guys lived essentially forever, wrote about his experience in the First World War. And it's a great novel. If you want to read a great novel about the First World War, I recommend it. It's quite chilling. He exulted in it. Though the aim for which I fought as an individual, as an atom in the whole body of the army, was not to be achieved, though material force cast us apparently to the earth, yet we learned once and for all to stand for a cause, and if necessary to fall as befitted men. It is not every generation that is so favored. Think about that. He was happy to have been in the World War I generation and exulted in that, and that was a theme throughout his work. There was another writer from that period who is a hero of mine, Erich Maria Remarque. He wrote Im Westen nichts Neues, All Quiet on the Western Front. Has a very different picture of war, a horror, the stupidity, the pointlessness, the suffering for nothing, for nothing. That book, of course, was banned by the Nazis and burned. He escaped from the country. Junger was celebrated as a hero. His works continued to be in print during the period of the Third Reich. And even Remarque's sister was beheaded on the orders of the People's Court of the National Socialist State. And the judge famously said, Ihr Bruder hat uns erwischt, aber Sie werden uns nicht erwischen. Your brother escaped us, but you will not escape us. Just to give you a sense of the horror of living under that evil regime. Well, his buddy, Carl Schmitt, defined the political as the opposition between friend and enemy. That is what makes political life. There are no friends if there are no enemies. We must have enemies, or we cannot have friendship. That was his view of the fundamental nature. And the enemy is not just the guy whose dog barks all night, who irritates you. It's the fighting collectivity you are willing to kill and willing to die in combat. That is what defines the political. You find Schmidt repeatedly, normally in the footnotes, because his own personal life was such a horror. He was such a shameful person, collaborator and active participant with the National Socialist Party. But consistently in far right and far left books, you find Schmidt, 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 Schmidt. Slavoj Žižek may be known to some of you. He has two part-time jobs. He's the most famous Marxist philosopher in Europe today and circus clown. He's an awful person, in my opinion. He was famous for saying Hitler's big problem was he wasn't violent enough. And when challenged by a reviewer, said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Well, you have to understand what I mean by violence." This is a typical extreme postmodern perspective. What I mean by violence is, well, Mahatma Gandhi was more violent because he succeeded in defeating the British. Well, that's a puzzling view of violence. Except then, he stated, in India, Gandhi's problem was he wasn't violent enough. He should have been more like Hitler. Apparently unaware of the internet, that the interviewer who interviewed him in the US Googled and found him saying the opposite in India. So he exults in violence. And as he pointed out, as a leftist, in contrast to Schmidt, a leftist position should insist on the unconditional primacy of the inherent antagonism as constitutive of the political. Men versus women, black versus white, tall versus short, gay versus straight. We could go down the list. All of the isms we hear, those are what make real life. It's when we're fighting with each other, not when we're cooperating. The liberals wanted to find a way gay and straight, black, white, all the different races, religions could live together in harmony. Religious toleration, equality before the law. Zizek exults in these forms of violence. Now, another group influenced by Schmidt, the American neoconservatives. Here we have William Crystal, embracing national greatness and restoring the sense of the heroic through war. The purpose of the Iraq War was to make us heroic. It's a great success. Don't you all feel like heroes now? Now that we saw how successful the invasion of Iraq turned out to be, it's a thriving liberal democracy. It's like Oregon. A tremendous, powerful success. But the purpose of it was for us to be heroic through war. Well, we can ask, is it a good idea? Does a society benefit from war? The evidence is no. Some do, or it wouldn't happen. Adam Smith was one of the first anti-imperialists. He did the numbers, the calculation. He looked at the wars that Britain had waged for its colonies, and he said, look at how much money was borrowed to finance the war. Then he calculated the annual interest, just the interest payments on the debt. It was greater than the value of all the trade with those colonies. He says there's no way this could be considered good for the nation. Good for someone, the people who got all the monopoly privileges, absolutely. But good for the nation? No, simply not. One of the best treatments of the economics of the British Empire by Davis and Huttenbach said it was quite clear the British as a whole certainly did not benefit economically from the empire. Not from India, not from the American colonies, not from the West Indies. They did not benefit. On the other hand, individual investors did, clearly. Someone benefited or it wouldn't have happened. But taken in the aggregate, it was a losing proposition. And as they point out also rather dryly, not a winning proposition for the colonized people either. Well, what about war for oil? We have been sent to the Middle East a number of times, and the argument is oil. As Secretary of State Baker said, a dictator, Saddam Hussein, who acting alone and unchallenged could strangle the global economic order. So of course we have to keep the flow of oil. Well, David Henderson, an economist, formerly of the Council of Economic Advisors and with the Cato Institute, did a calculation. It wasn't all that complicated. He said they assume the military expenditure is costless, but it's not. Every time I buy a battleship, it's expensive. I'm sure you have that experience every time you buy an aircraft carrier. These cost a lot of money. So just look at the numbers. The value, the price rather, of that military expenditure. Now contrast it with the worst case scenario in oil. Assume Saddam Hussein didn't want to sell it and block the Straits of Hormuz. Assume he's stupid and irrational, in other words. He desperately wanted to sell the oil. It tastes terrible. You can't drink it. If you don't sell it, it does you no good. But assume he was irrational. We have a price system. The price would go up. The hit to our economy would be smaller under the worst case scenario than the expenditure for the military. But this is the mistake these people make. They assume military expenditure is costless. It isn't. William Niskanen, a former colleague of mine, he passed away recently, was on the Council of Economic Advisors, and he debated James Woolsey of the CIA, former director. And Woolsey said, oil, 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 on the case for the Second Iraq War. And he said, it is not worth a war. Bill was a very profoundly ethical and religious man. He said, we'll set all of the ethical concerns to the side. I'm just going to talk as an economist for the moment. There's a world price for oil. It's a commodity. The price in Britain and the price in Japan are basically the same. It's a commodity. If the price goes up, we have ways of dealing with this. It's called the market economy. It is not worth going to war for oil. Now, Steven Pinker, I mentioned in this book, one of the most striking things he points out that no one believes until they see the data. The world is more peaceful than it was in the past. That violence has been declining. It doesn't seem like it. Every time you turn on the news, war, beheading, horror, rape, assault, killing. But that's because of the phenomenon in news. If it bleeds, it leads. That's news. I've never seen a headline that said, yesterday 7 billion people went around their business and none of them killed anyone. It's just not news. But violence is news. But if you look at the data, it's been going down, and for a very, very long time. So the question is, what can we learn about that? Well, let's look at the role of democracies. Democracy seems pretty much an anti-war movement. Democracies go to war with non-democracies, but not very often with other democracies. And as democracy has spread, violence between states has declined as a consequence. We'll notice something about this. These are major hotspots at the time that this was written. They're pretty much in poor parts of the world. We don't see a lot of violence in economically developed areas where people have developed more to lose. Economic development is a very important part of this. Irgarsky's, professor at UC San Diego, looked at the role of trade in diminishing violence and the likelihood of war. He has a very nice chapter in that, looking at the incentives that trade creates to diminish violence among persons. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the significance of this. This is looking at growth of international trade. This is the average polity score, which means democracy, rule of law. You notice it declines during this period. This was actually the decolonization period, which meant there were more countries in the world, many of which were not very well governed, not very democratic. But that began to change as more of those decolonized nations became more rule of law oriented. He looked at the world exports, and in part of the book graphs that against violence, negative relationship. This is a little bit out of date. It would pop up lately. It's wars that resulted in changes of territory, wars of conquest, dramatic decline. Now, had this been done just a little bit later, it would have bumped up. We saw 2 wars recently, one in Abkhazia and Ossetia, in Georgia, that resulted in effective annexation by the Russian Federation, and Crimea, just in this year. So there'll be a little bump up here, but the trend nonetheless remains profoundly negative. A businessman from here in California, whom I interviewed for the book, put it very neatly. He's a tomato processor. He's one of the biggest in the world. He squishes tomatoes and turns them into pizza sauce. And he put it, when you see other people as customers, it doesn't really occur to you to want to shoot them. That's really basic insight, and that's the point that economists have tried to stress. When you see people as customers, it doesn't occur to you to want to shoot them. And that is a good thing if more people can be considered customers. Let me conclude with this note. This has been understood actually for a long time. There was a book written many years ago by a famous poet. I understand he has a television show now in the U.S. His name is Homer. And one of his poems is called the Odyssey. Some of you may have read this. Odysseus wants to go home to his wife, Penelope, after the wars. And by the way, the Iliad and the Odyssey are very different books. The Iliad is a book for teenage boys. It's about war and girls. So two very important things. Right? War and girls. And violence and conquest and glory. The opening, sing goddess of the rage of Achilles, is angry. The Odyssey is an adult poem. It's about a grown man wanting to return to his wife and return to peace. And many-colored Odysseus, as he's called. He's wily and clever. He's not impetuous like Achilles. But when his ship lands on the island of the Cyclops, they discover the Cyclops is not very hospitable. He attacks them and eats the sailors in the crew. Odysseus challenges him, and he asks, "What is my guest gift?" It was traditional in Greek society, if you land on my island, I give you food, water, and shelter. You can go about your business. It's a guest gift. I might land on your island someday, and I would hope for that reciprocity. And Zeus is called the god of strangers, by the way, the all-seeing God. He sees. If you cheat a shipwreck victim, God will see you, and you will pay. So it's a society based on reciprocity. He says, "What is my guest gift?" And the Cyclops says, "I'll eat you last." Not that great. And then this passage explaining why the Cyclops is a savage is quite powerful. It says, "For the Cyclops have no ships with crimson prows, no shipwrights there to build them good, strong craft that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men." Trade brings us together in peace. We see other people as opportunities for mutual advantage. But the Cyclops does not trade. And when he sees another person, he sees a snack. He doesn't see a person with whom he could engage in mutually beneficial exchange. And then last, again, from my great hero, I mentioned one other thing, actually, in the book. From Sarah Squires, a professor of literature, I believe very strongly economists should spend more time also talking about art. And that's very, very important. And Deirdre McCloskey also has promoted this. She's a professor of economics and history. And Sarah has a very nice piece on the art, if you will, of war. Mark Twain's fabulous war prayer, which expresses in the most clear language what war is about. And I encourage you to read it because it's a very powerful essay, not so well known by Mark Twain. And then Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen was a great English poet. He wrote poems about his experience in the First World War. He was killed exactly 1 week before the armistice was signed. And he was one of the last victims in the war. And his poetry is very, very powerful as someone who had been in war and seen it up close. And as I mentioned, finally, my hero, Frederick Bastiat, in the French National Assembly, when he was being so critical of all of these plans for huge military expenditures and so on, he was asked, "Well, what is your plan, Monsieur Bastiat?" And this was his response: "Liberty within, peace without. This is the entire plan." And I think that is a very good and coherent response. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your thoughts as well. And I understand we have a microphone.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Palmer, for a very interesting talk. We're about to move to the question and answer portion of our program, which is also very interesting. We hope you can stay for that, but we do understand some of you have classes, and so if that's you, we'll give you a few seconds, a minute or so to leave so that then the rest of us can stay and enjoy this last portion of the talk tonight. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will come around to you with the microphone, and you can ask your question to Dr. Palmer.
Okay.
Palmer, yeah. Palmer? Palmer.
Okay.
Hello, Professor Plummer. My name is Megan, and this is just a theoretical question I asked for you. When I came here a little bit late, and the first thing I heard is that you said that the desirable result is less war and more peace. And maybe in assuming that actually it's an absolute, you want no war and absolute peace, if you can put that. In a lot of funding for wars is generally is always part of a budget. There's an annual budget for war fundings. My question to you is, assuming that if you replace spending for war for a perfect substitute for it, and you have to spend the money on something else that isn't war, where would you put that money that came from the funding from war to something that theoretical good too, in the case you have to, and assuming you have to spend it, all that money?
Well, I would let the taxpayers keep it. Okay. They're the ones who made it. So, but I think that it's not a flip answer. It really is important, and I'll tell you why. People have plans for their own resources, their own lives, and the idea that someone else can just override them because they have another plan, I think is an injustice. And it also assumes that somehow there's no cost to that. But as I mentioned, Frederick Bastiat focused on what is not seen, what didn't happen because this happened. So we see the benefit of the state, and behind the question, it's a very common question, it's very well formulated. Behind that is the normal discussion in Washington, if we don't spend it on this, shall we spend it on that? It doesn't occur to them that maybe we could let the people who earned the money spend it on something. They might have some plans for it as well. What would they have done with it? Maybe they would invest in their children's education, or maybe they'd go on a vacation, or they'd build a house, or they would buy medicine. Who knows? It's not possible for us to know that. But we know that they would have liked to have done something with it. And that is what is almost never discussed in Washington, D.C. Amity Schlaze has a book on this called The Forgotten Man. It's an unfortunate term. Man in English means human being, doesn't mean gendered person. The forgotten person, we might say today, is the one who's out there earning the money and producing it. And no one thinks, well, what plans did they have for it before it was taxed away? So that is really what I would do. That said, I do think that there are some expenditures related to national security that are reasonable. We don't want to be invaded, so you need to have some kind of capacity to defend the nation. We need a diplomatic corps. I believe in international arbitration. And I believe in a military budget, a defense budget and not an offense budget. And we don't need to have troops all over the planet, each one of which is a tripwire for our involvement in war. Most people don't know we now have AFRICOM. We have a whole military command dedicated to Africa. There are currently drones flying all over West Africa. And President Obama graciously offered to fight Ebola by sending soldiers. One of my good friends from Sierra Leone said, no thanks. We doctors, that's cool, right? Bleach, medical devices, all those things, but really, please do not send soldiers to fight Ebola. This is a big mistake. So I think we should also begin to close down a lot of those military bases. They're not about defending the United States of America. Yes, sir.
So in the beginning, you talked about constitutional issues and things like that, and that seems to be part of maybe the popular media is asking these questions. Does a president have to go to Congress to get okays for some things? And you talked about the security, TSA, and lying and stuff like that. So who holds, other than voters holding politicians accountable, which I don't think is going to happen, how else should people react to, trying to put some sense of this is unconstitutional, what do we do about it? Because I don't think Congress is going to go to court over these things.
Well, the House almost voted to defund the NSA because of Justin Amash. And they lost by just a couple of votes, but it really shocked the establishment that they came that close. A lot of people were very angry when we discovered it. I'll mention the Snowden case. When it first came out, I said, I'm neutral. I don't know what happened. I want to find out more before I decide he's a hero or a villain. And the more I found out, the more I considered him to be a hero. That what he did was just, it was legal, he was standing up for the rule of law at great personal risk to himself. So things like that matter. There is a move in Congress, more members of Congress, demanding that Congress exercise its authority over foreign policy. The Constitution says Congress shall have that power, not the president. It's very explicit. And the president, not just this, it's not a Democrat thing or a Republican thing, it's president after president after president saying, I have the authority to put us in a state of war just on my say-so. And I think we should say, no, you do not have that authority. That is specifically denied to you in the Constitution. How can you be more clear? But Congress has to stand up, and I do think giving them the backbone to do that is important. Now, there's a reason they don't want to, because who wants responsibility, right? Why not be a teenager forever? That's what they want. Let the president take responsibility. Then we can criticize if we don't like it. We can be such great statesmen as Hillary Clinton, right? When she was criticized for voting for the Iraq War, she said, well, if I had known it would have turned out badly, I wouldn't have voted for it. So, well, yeah, that's a principled kind of stand. But what we need is members of Congress who say beforehand, we will make that decision. We will have a debate. The Parliament of the United Kingdom has had these debates. They voted not to get involved in Syria initially. Now they voted to bomb. I think it was a mistake. But they had a parliamentary debate, and that is what our law demands in this country. Yep.
Frequent policy of the United States has been to use embargoes to try to punish foreign countries when things like Russia invades Chechnya or Crimea, etc. Is that an effective tool? Because it appears to me that it's not.
They don't work, and the overwhelming evidence from all the studies that have been done of trade restrictions and sanctions is that they do not achieve their ostensible purpose. Now, there are a couple of interesting exceptions. We can look at, well, first of all, I mentioned one of the great successes, and that was the Cuban embargo. As you know, Fidel Castro was removed from power in 1965, and Cuba since then has been a peaceful, democratic country. It's a very, very successful trade embargo on Cuba, and I'm deeply grateful to our government for liberating the Cubans. But not all have been as successful as the Cuban embargo. They generally don't work. Now, there's a couple of exceptions depending on how you classify the data. The trade embargoes on South Africa over apartheid were not successful. It actually restructured the economy in the hands of the state, much more entrenched apartheid interests. But it does seem, there's strong evidence, that the cultural embargo on South Africa did have a major impact, namely sporting teams and orchestras and so on boycotted South Africa. And that made the elite in the society who were democratically empowered, in the small population, it was a democracy. They were ashamed. They were just ashamed of it. And that helped to bring about support for overturning apartheid internally. But it was not the trade embargo which strengthened apartheid. It was the cultural one. But by and large, they're a failure. They're not a very useful tool of foreign policy. They're about us feeling good about ourselves. We showed them. Look at what's happening in Russia right now. This is an example of applied stupidity. There should be a class at university, Applied Stupidity 101. And all of our politicians go to it. Because they said, if you don't stop, we're going to embargo, we're going to put sanctions on you guys. We're going to really do it. We're going to come up with a list of all you guys will put sanctions on you. We'll take your stuff that you have in our bank accounts. Well, what did they do? They closed all their bank accounts. They immunized themselves long before any of these things were done. So they liquidated all their holdings in the West. The memo went out from the Kremlin to all of these guys, and they're criminals, by the way. These are not nice people. They're gangsters and so on. And they liquidated all their assets. They went to cash, they went to gold, they reinvested in Russia. There's nothing to take. And particularly when you keep saying, you do this anymore and I'll hurt you, well, people then make it difficult to hurt them. So these are totally useless, just completely useless. And I don't think they're going to have a big impact. And by the way, I should mention, just before the Crimean intervention, all of the top officers of Gazprom, which is a state-owned company, but there are private ownership, there's private equity involved also, every single one of them sold 100% of their shares before the Crimean intervention. The so-called little green men popped up and arrested the members of parliament and so on. They got the memo from the boss. And so they went to zero, and immediately the day after there was a 40% tumble in Gazprom's share price. Well, it's great to be an insider in those circumstances. So I do not think these are useful. They just don't work, other than making us feel good about ourselves. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you talked about how, like, in the global economy now, there's less war and we're becoming more peaceful as a culture, or as a people of the world, I would say. Sound like Bono, but do you think that now with that becoming the norm, maybe the quest for conquest is put behind the quest for obtaining resources?
Well, there's two different ways, at least, to obtain resources. So let's say your shirt is a resource, and I want it. I could offer you something you'd like in exchange. So $1, would $1 be enough for your shirt? Probably not. $400? Would you sell me your shirt for $400? He would. Okay. So he doesn't have such an expensive Savile Row haberdasher. So $400, I can buy it from you, and someplace in between, probably. Or I could just come and club you and take it from you. Right? And I'm a very mean person. I could do it. So those are two ways for me to get your shirt. The point is, the second has been declining in significance as a means to get stuff. That's the point. So there's not wars for resources. And in particular, something like a commodity, it's a commodity. It has a meaning to talk about a commodity. What's happened there? It's okay. The Chinese government is currently investing massive amounts of money in Africa. People look at this and say, oh, this is a bad thing, good thing. What does it mean? There's a lot of road building. Chinese companies make fairly good roads. So you go to African countries, and if you see pretty good roads, there's a fairly good chance they're Chinese contractors. They don't treat local people very well, but the road does get built. They're spending a gigantic premium to gain access to oil, copper, and other resources, way above the market price. And when I was in Beijing a couple years ago, meeting with what is the Council of Economic Advisors equivalent in Beijing, I talked to them, and I said, you know this is stupid. You don't talk that way in China, but I said, you realize there's a deficit of wisdom in this. And they said, but we want to have access to the resource. I said, it's a commodity. Copper is a commodity. You can buy it from Chile. You can buy it from various other countries. It's a commodity. Why are you paying a premium to get ownership? What happens if you get ownership of South Sudan oil fields and then they renege on the deal? What are you going to do? Send the People's Liberation Army to South Sudan? Really? You're going to do that? No, of course not. You're You're cheating yourselves. It's stupid. And they'll eventually figure that out. They're spending a staggering amount of money to get ownership over a commodity. Let other people own it and then buy it from them. It's much smarter. But ultimately, they're not going to go to war over that. Much, much too costly. And although they've made dumb mistakes, they're not that dumb. So that's not going to happen.
There are many reasons we go to war, and I don't know all of them, but the one that's the hardest for me to combat is the claim that we are helping out the innocent people of whatever region who are being oppressed by whatever other group that we now have to exterminate in order to help them. Now, I know you're a terribly mean individual, as you've stated before, but how would you address those types of concerns?
It's called humanitarian interventionism. And it usually doesn't rest on these economic fallacies, although sometimes you'll find them all mixed together. They put every conceivable argument into a blender and spin it up. But we can nonetheless distinguish them. So in the Iraq War, we got the oil argument, an economic argument. We got the argument he was a threat to us. Remember the weapons of mass destruction that they didn't find, and so on. And then we also got the humanitarian interventionism, because Saddam Hussein was a brutal psychopath. He really was a very, very bad, cruel, terrible person, and he killed a lot of people. So any one of those we can address. They were all just thrown at us all at the same time. Let's look at them. The economic argument was bunk. There was no evidence for the threat to us, and the administration did not lie openly. They did not say that Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks, but they implied it repeatedly. They said 9/11 Saddam, 9/11, 9/11 Saddam, Saddam, 9/11, 9/11 Saddam, Saddam, so that many people thought there was a connection. Although, if you parse them, they never said he was responsible, but they deliberately created the belief in a large percentage of the population that Saddam Hussein was involved in the 9/11 attacks, which he was not. Osama bin Laden was one of his enemies also. So let's then turn to this humanitarian interventionism. The question then is to ask, at the very least, are you making things better? And the Hippocratic Oath is applicable here. First, do no harm. And we should always remember that. First thing, do no harm. It could be, and there are people suffering horrible injustices. First question is, will we make it better for them, or will we be harmful? If you look at the overall picture of Iraq, it is hard to say that our intervention made that a better country. For some people, and so on, for the Kurds, they became quasi-autonomous, so there's some beneficiaries. But the U.S. overall plunged that country into a horror, far worse than they would have anticipated, even under their brutal dictator. That brutal dictatorship was cemented in power partly by the restrictions, the Oil for Peace program. It was as successful as the Cuban embargo at removing him from power. It cemented his power because now, in order to get cooking oil, rice, and other things, you had to go and get your ration from the state. It gave the state more power over the population, which they used quite ruthlessly. So I do think that you can make a case, if it's articulated clearly and not mixed up with a lot of fallacies, for humanitarian interventionism. But first, are you sure you're going to make the situation better? Are there other alternatives? And I don't have a problem with people arming to go off and fight a war of liberation against brutal, fighting terrible, oppressive people. Fine with me. There are other options. And then you can come down to finally the last question, and why I think it's not a wise thing for the American government to do this. And that is it authorized in the Constitution, which says to provide for the common defense of the United States of America? And if not, I think there's a strong presumption against doing that. So that's a kind of cascading set of reasons. I think it's a bad idea. I do not think it is motivated by the foolishness, maybe naivete, but not the bad thinking of the other arguments. Are we doing on time? One or two more? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Mr. Palmer, I really like the way you think. I've enjoyed this immensely. And as you were talking, my mind was going down to the ordinary, everyday level. And the people who have to make something either right or wrong. And if they're right or wrong, then you have to punish the person that's wrong. And I teach conflict resolution. I teach conciliation, mediation, those kinds of things, which is a way of resolving conflict without having to arm wrestle and be right or wrong. And as I was thinking about that, I was also thinking about what happens when you're watching somebody horribly abuse another human being. And your only alternative, or at least in my mind, the only alternative I can think of, is to physically stop that oppression.
Sure.
And so your last comment kind of answered where my question is going, which is basically, where do you draw the line? I mean, I'm Jewish, and I am very happy that at some point we went into war during the Second World War. So how do you make those judgments?
Let me mention something a little controversial about the last point. One thing would have been not to turn away the refugee boats. This was a great crime, really, that our government committed, and others. People fleeing a horrifying totalitarian state, and they were turned back. And I think this is a stain on American history. There are a number of stains, if you want to think about that, the experience of slavery, mistreatment of Indians, incarceration, internment of the Japanese. We could make a long list. That's on the list, absolutely. The war was not even waged to liberate the Jews. There was almost no discussion. They didn't want to talk about that, although some people tried to alert them of the slave labor and the death camps. But it was not a part of the motivation for the war. But there are cases in which horrific acts require a response. It's not clear that the American government is a very good deliverer of that response in most cases. So let's take the case of North Korea. It may be the saddest place in the world today. And the experience of Jews, Gypsies in the death camps is comparable to what North Koreans experience. It's horrific. If you want to read Escape from Camp 14, it is chilling. The only person born in a slave labor camp who escaped. He's very, very remarkable person, and we work with him and with our Korean partners. So we work with a number of North Koreans, and the stories they tell you will just curdle your blood. You cannot imagine what they have gone through. 2 million people were starved to death in the 1990s by that psychotic regime. If you utter the smallest criticism, you can be punished. Your family is punished. 3 generations execution. And gruesome also. What are we going to do about that? We know it's happening. What are we doing about it? We can't. They have nuclear weapons. There's nothing we can do about that right now. What we can do is the sort of thing that my colleagues do. We do smuggle a lot of material into North Korea. We produce USB drives that have Wikipedia in Korean. So it's not political. It's not Frederick Bastiat or my great heroes. It's just the world in Korean on these little USB drives. And thank God for Chinese entrepreneurship. They make these little tiny DVD drives. They're quite small, so where you can see a movie, a little screen. And there's a massive demand in North Korea now for South Korean pop culture, because North Korea is boring beyond belief. I actually sat once in a restaurant, and the TV screen had an entire show on how to kill rats. So you can imagine what a hopping place that is. As I was watching, I thought, what is this, like a children's show about animals? Oh, God, no. It showed that people killing these rats, because rats get in and they eat the food and the crops, so the whole population is mobilized against rats. Well, that's entertainment. Or the cartoon show I watched was the bloodiest children's cartoon I've ever seen in my life. The foreigners come, and then they have to be beheaded and bayoneted by people. There's just splatters of blood all over them. It's not fun. Young people like fun. They want to see hip-hop and Korean rap music and fun things. So there's a huge market. The good news is, and these are smuggled across the border by quite brave smugglers who do this. The good news is the Chinese make them with a USB port so they can get more information than just pop music. And there is a change in that country, and that's what we're trying to do for them. But I think military intervention, there's no way you could help those people. Just no way. So it tugs at the heart, but there's nothing we can do for them with the U.S. Army, much as we might like it to be otherwise. Yes, sir.
Well, I think we have time just for one more question.
Okay.
We're pushing up against the end of our time for this part, but I would like to remind everyone that, as is our custom immediately following this talk, we will adjourn to Flames Eatery on 4th and San Fernando, and the Economics Department will host some food and drinks that you're all welcome to, and we can continue the conversation there if you didn't have time to ask your question or discuss the issue that you were thinking about. But as I mentioned, we do have time for one more question. So, Daniel, you're the last one.
Yeah. You mentioned that war is the health of the state, and during war, government grows in power. And that seems to me like government has very little incentive to not go to war. Government likes war. It's one of the few things they're good at. And, it seems to me that there's very little incentive for them to defend people. The biggest, I would say that the biggest mass murderers on Earth has been the government. And I guess a two-part question, I guess. One is just, what incentives do you think there are to reduce war? And two, maybe, it would be better to not, have the government monopolization of defense, but allow private or guerrilla-style warfare, which, instead of people who are not spending their own money and blood.
It's worth thinking about that in some context, but what we have found is the incidence of violence has declined. And so we can ask, what accounts for that? So something changed. And that declines under conditions of government. Now, one thing that Pinker argues in his book, and I think you in particular, given the background of your question, would enjoy it, not because you'll agree with it, you'll hate it in that regard, but it will challenge you. He argues that the establishment of governments with monopoly enforcement powers was a major driver in the reduction of randomized violence, just like killings just out on the streets and so on. And he gives a pretty good case for that. Now, he, I think, overlooks the fact that there are other institutions that provide diminution of force. There were things such as the Peace of God movement, which is a very important movement in Europe from about the 11th century to the 15th century, that brought about a generalized diminution in violence. They would get together people, the priests would come out and say, there's all this fighting, people are fighting over honor and so on. Why don't we just all resolve, no one will fight on Sunday? So, okay, that's a day of worship, and God says you should hang out and do godly things, so Sunday we won't fight. Everyone for it? Anyone against that? Is anyone who likes fighting on Sunday? Oh, you, over there. Okay. Go stand over there so we will know who you are. Those are the violent, scary people who fight all the time. So let's, know them and not hang out with them. It's a strong incentive for them to come in, right? You get overcoming free rider problems. And they did this through publicity. Then they said, well, Tuesday's a pretty cool day also. It's Tuesday, and it's, maybe we shouldn't fight on Tuesday. And St. Frithesweed's Day, right? Famous local saint who converted a stone into a diamond or whatever, some local saint. Let's not fight on her birthday too. So, which is one of the reasons why Catholic countries are full of all these holidays. They were initially days you don't fight on. Now they're just, you go to the beach and so on. But that was really the reason for that. They're holy days. You don't fight on the day of some local saint. Often didn't exist, but was a local myth. But he makes a strong case that the establishment of monopoly states reduced that kind of violence. And I challenge you, I think you'll enjoy reading it, because he takes you on directly on that. But then the second question is, if we really want to reduce war, I could write a treatise on why we should abolish the military. And maybe I'll get tenure at some place for doing that. Great. But I'm also interested in what we can do for the currently existing states who are not trying to abolish themselves to reduce their propensity for war. Free trade is one way to do that. Increase the incentives among the population. All states are to some degree or another responsive to their populations. Even dictatorships are in some way responsive to the population. If they alienate everybody, the dictator finds out he's out of power. They have to respond in some way. Increase the incentives of persons to want to maintain trade across borders, and that will make the world more peaceful. And that's good enough for me. I'm not against writing books on why we should abolish the army. It's not where I'm going to put my effort. And I think in the short term, there are things we can do. International arbitration, conflict resolution. I'm in favor of diplomacy. And even there's some evidence that peacekeeping forces have helped to reduce violence in violence-prone areas. It's a mixed bag, but the evidence seems overall that they do have a positive impact. And then more important than anything else, trade, freedom of travel, and freedom of information. I think those are very practical things. I'm not against what you suggested. But these, I think, are things more of us could get involved in and have a positive impact. Well, I hope you enjoy the book. I hope that you get some benefit from it. If you disagree with it, it's okay. And send me a letter about it, and I'll read it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Palmer, once again for your wonderful talk. I'll be proceeding directly to Flames. I hope to see many of you there. Thank you for your attention.